And welcome to what absolutely promises to be a great episode of Dogma Debate, because I've got John Collins here, author John Collins. And I came across John's work because of the very unfortunate event of the shootings in Minnesota by what I would, with my layman's terms, call a religious nutball. And I started looking into it. And, I've talked many times on the show about Christian nationalism, the Heritage Foundation, and how this all ties into what's going on in America today. But I discovered the New Apostolic Reformation is actually the movement that the gentleman, I almost said gentleman, I can't call this man a gentleman, Vance Bolter, the piece of garbage who is responsible for the shootings in Minnesota, associates himself with the New Apostolic Reformation. And John is an absolute expert on it. In fact, he's written a book on the subject entitled Weaponized Religion from Christian Identity to the NAR, New Apostolic Reformation. We've got him here today to teach us all about it. John, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. So your history is you actually came up in the church.
I did. So I grew up in the Branham Tabernacle, which many people today will not be familiar with this name, but William Branham was the leader of the post-World War II healing revival. So from 1947 till his death in 1965, he was a very famous public figure, deeply embedded into the type of Christianity that birthed what you're talking about. So whenever you call Vance Bolter a religious nut, I can say from a former religious nut to you, I can sympathize with many of the things that apparently had gone through his head. I don't know yet exactly all the details of why he did what he did. But what I can say is from the limited amount of research that I have been able to do and piece together, it is definitely tied to the same type of religion. And I can trace it all the way back to my grandfather's church. My grandfather
Wow.
was the head pastor at the Branham Tabernacle. So from this little place in Jeffersonville, Indiana, where there is literally nothing else, here's a church that birthed this mess that we see today.
Right. And what is this mess we see today? What is the New Apostolic Reformation? I understand it's not so much a branch of Christianity as much as it is just an loose association between a bunch of different churches.
Yeah, absolutely. It is the best way to describe it is if you take the worst elements of extremist Christianity for several decades and create a cafeteria style religion where you can pick and choose all of the worst elements that you can find, piece it together, you have the New Apostolic Reformation. There is no headquarters that is called the New Apostolic Reformation. There is not a central governing body. Instead, what we have created are several apostolic networks wherein different groups of different theologies and belief sets are all communicating and organizing through different conventions and different ministries associating with other ministries. So it turns into this Heinz 57 type religion. But at its core, you have a very dark history that most of them have covered up. I discovered some of that history as I was examining my own church. What I did not know when I began my journey was that this little church from Jeffersonville, Indiana, where William Branham headquartered his ministry, it was a global ministry. But what I didn't realize is that it birthed all of these other things. And as I'm starting to piece together all of the different ministries that he associated with and all of the different splinter groups that emerged from it, I began to realize they're all kind of connected. And it wasn't until I, like you, discovered the New Apostolic Reformation that I could even make sense of it, because they're so different, yet all organized in such a way where they're in collaboration.
Right. Do you mind giving us a little bit of that dark history and tying it all together to the world we live in now?
Absolutely. So I'll try to be careful with my words because you mentioned you might put this on YouTube. Some of the history is so dark that if I actually say some of the words, I get filtered on YouTube, which has been a
Wow.
huge problem. I had through experimentation, I had to learn what I can say and can't say about this history because it is that bad. But in the you're familiar with the birth of Pentecostalism, I'm assuming, if you studied this to any
Yeah,
degree. But you have
sure.
the birth of Pentecostalism that's happening on the West Coast, and you have on the East Coast, you have the birth of the 1915 Ku Klux Klan. And at the same time, all of this is brewing, you have this thing that's called British Israelism that is forming a strong foothold in the United States. And all of these pieces come together. They are, even though they seem quite separate, they do all come together. But British Israelism is the notion that the British Isles and the United States were the direct descendants of the lost 10 tribes of Israel. And people
Wow.
of that mindset believe that any of the blessings that are given to Israel, to the children of Israel in the Bible, those same blessings apply to today. And so, as they're reading through the Bible and they find blessings of land or dominion over different nations that they've conquered, etc., they apply that, even though the Bible is referring to something that's, you know, millennia ago. Well, as that is being birthed at the same time of Christian identity, obviously, many of the people who were in um, the Klan, people who were in the Klan who had the racist theology, merged in with this. And over time, British Israelism began to shift into a more anti Semitic, anti Black, anti Catholic. You had all the elements that the Klan stood against coming into British Israelism. So then it became more than just simply we are the children of Israel today. Instead, we identify with these things, these concepts, and they must exclude these other races. This turned into pure chaos whenever the influx of Jews started, actual Jews started coming into the nation, because Christian identity viewed those as the false Jews. So they felt like the nation was being taken over by false Jews.
So who were the real
All
Jews? They were, because they were the
they
descendants of.
they
I
were
can't
the
help but
yeah, they were the descendants.
yeah, interesting. And I can't help but point out that there's some crossover with Mormonism there. Uh,
There's a lot of crossover with Mormonism, actually.
interesting, interesting.
Yeah.
These American versions of Christianity.
Yeah, exactly. The best book on it that I have found, anybody who's interested in this weird history, Michael Barkun's book, Religion and the Racist Right, walks you through all of that history pretty well. That that book for me was a gold mine. I have a partner who was going through it at the same time I was, and we were piecing together what Barkun had in his research with what we had in our research, and started to notice it began to fit like a glove, because we're starting to see key concepts of what was Christian identity being embedded into the Pentecostal movement. And at first glance, I looked at it and I just kind of thought, it maybe it was somewhat popular back then, and maybe that's why they accepted it. But no, it actually became core concepts, became core theology. Um, Probably the biggest, darkest one that really stuck. They were teaching in Christian identity groups that the Eve, the mother of all living, produced Cain by having sex with the serpent. So Cain was not actually fully human. He was subhuman. And through his lineage, they traced him all the way through the lineage of Ham, one of the sons of Noah, which just happened to be believed to be the black people in Africa. They traced this lineage and started to claim that there were, in today's world, there were pure people that descended from Adam and Eve. Then there were these subhumans that descended from Cain and the serpent. This weird mess, this was the core concept of Christian identity. You either identified with Adam's race or you identified with the serpent's race. And so as that began to spread, I'm starting to notice that there are more than just the cult that I grew up in that are believing this. This seemed to spread across several different groups. And I began to piece together how all of those connections were made, which I walk through quite a bit of that in my book.
Right. I've heard it said the mark of Ham or something like
Yes,
that was
Curse of Ham.
curse of Ham, right? Um, and I mean, just off the top of my head, I can't help but wonder that. So they consider themselves better because they are the product of Adam and Eve, but their great great grandmother on the side was having sex with serpents. Doesn't seem like a very great great. Doesn't seem like a great 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 grandmother to me. But
Yeah.
okay,
It's such a weird thing, man. I'm embarrassed to say that I believe some of this nonsense, but I was taught from birth to believe this. This was something that we were taught. Now, after the 60s, this turned into something, it morphed into something else because once you started to have the race riots and the government getting involved, you can't openly say these things. This just isn't this isn't how it's going to be, right? So it kind of went
right.
underground. The version of it that I grew up with, we were taught different concepts of the same theology, but separately. So we were taught that this lineage that came from Cain was the evil seed, but then we were taught that this was a spiritual thing, not a physical thing, but yet it required sex, which those two things cannot go together. But in a cult, you through cognitive dissonance, you just don't even think about that kind of thing. So I was taught that it wasn't a racist theology, but at the same time, I was taught that you cannot have a person with black skin to marry a person with white skin, or you would create a hybrid person. That was part of our core theology. And we were taught, well, that's not racist. God just likes the different colors of the different people, He doesn't like them mixed. So I grew up in that type of theology, which is horrific. I'm embarrassed to say that, right? But what people don't understand, and there's a point to all of this that I'm driving at, all of that history that I have just talked about, if you trace it all the way through to the big ministries today, you're going to find all of them go back to that lineage. For example, I know you've mentioned a couple of churches on the phone that we or on the text that we were talking about, but Joel Osteen, big
Yeah.
mega church in Houston, his father, John Osteen, was part of this movement. Was he anti Semitic? Did he believe Christian identity? I don't know, but he was part of the movement that did. So as you're tracing all of these people and connections together, you start to realize that if enough people were joined in it who did believe the dark, sinister things, at some point, everyone who's involved with that movement had to have come in contact with those dark, sinister things. And they had to actively make a choice. Do I stay with these people who believe this horrific thing, or do I walk away? And sadly, I'm learning that a lot of people just didn't walk away.
Yeah. And I want to get into what it is that they believe and what their goals are here in America today. But I'll point out that I did come across Paula White's name in association. I guess no one is particularly loud and proud with their New Apostolic Reformation ties. It's not like a badge of honor they wear, but these ties are there and they can be discovered. And Paula White, Donald Trump's spiritual advisor, who speaks in tongues on the White House lawn, she is somehow affiliated with the New Apostolic Reformation as well.
Absolutely. I mean, there's
And
so many
she's in the White
connections
House.
in the White House. Well, there are these pictures. You can go on the internet and you can find all of the different people who are gathering around the president and praying with him. There's some really weird characters if you know who they are. But Paula White is part of what was called the prosperity gospel. She was really big into that, and I guess still is, word of faith movement. All of that comes from the same thing. The key figures in the word of faith were organized in different various organizations associated with Branhamism. And after Branham died, it turned into the charismatic movement and beyond. But what happened is through Branhamism, they created all of these apostolic networks, one of which might be Word of Faith, one of which might be the prosperity gospel, the Pentecostalism. There's different sects that organized under this. But there was this network, this umbrella of ministers that was created through, there was a magazine called The Voice of Healing. And this was the magazine that was created to promote William Branham and his ministry. But there was more power in promoting all of the other ministries and creating like a pyramid scheme of ministries. So they would have all of these ministers in these conventions, and they would all connect together through this thing. That organization developed and transitioned into what became Christ for the Nations, which is part of our discussion we'll get into later. But because of this, you had people who were in the Word of Faith and the Prosperity Gospel, the movements that birthed Paula White. You had those central figures in this. And the interesting part about all of this is that one of the key figures that was in that epicenter whenever it began to branch out into these ministries was named T.L. Osborne, who worked closely with William Branham and openly declared at Branham's memorial service after he died that William Branham was God sent down in human flesh.
Wow.
And the interesting part of that's not the interesting part. The interesting part of that is that when he said it, and he openly said, some of you might think I'm sacrilegious when I say this, and I'm paraphrasing greatly, but this was God in human flesh. The interesting part about that is, out of all of the people who would birth the charismatic movement that were involved in this thing, there was not a single person who stood up and said, no, man, you can't say that William Branham is God in the flesh. And this man went on to create, as you know, the Prosperity Gospel and work with several key figures in other movements.
Right. And it is part of the New Apostolic Reformation's belief system that there are new prophets and new apostles that walk amongst us now. And I assume with that, that is the assumption that these people are in direct communication with the creator of the universe, and he's telling them his dictates, and they are passing it along.
Right. And anytime you have two or three of these so-called prophets and gathered together, the way prophecy generally works among them is somebody will say something randomly. I've witnessed this happen. They'll say something randomly. I believe that something's going to happen, whatever it is. I believe the Chiefs are going to win the ball game. Well, when it happens, then you've got another prophet to back it up and say, I was with him whenever God told him that the Chiefs were going to win the football game. And because you have that network, there's power in that network. The people look up to these people as spiritual authorities. They look up to them as the absolute truth on absolute ultimate decisions on scripture and truth. So whenever they have that level of authority, they will believe anything they say.
Right. And at some point, all of evangelical Christianity, which was once somewhat apolitical, became political. And the New Apostolic Reformation is part of that movement where they believe that they should be. I mean, we're talking about the Seven Mountains movement as well. I mean, this all ties in, which is the belief that there are seven categories to which Christianity should be at the top of the mountain. That is to say, dictating, ruling. That is government, entertainment, society, law. I can't remember all seven off the top of my head, but I mean, this is not benign, but rather very active in our society, and we're witnessing what happens when they gain power.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. We're witnessing, more to the point, we're witnessing history repeating itself. And it's repeated itself multiple times, which I also cover in the latest book. But the Seven Mountains, for example, William Branham and his mentor, whose name was Roy E. Davis. Roy E. Davis was the second in command of the 1915 KKK, and he was one of the original people who signed the contracts and the constitutions for the Klan, etc. When the Klan was exposed as a terrorist organization in, I think it was 1924-ish, when it was exposed as being a terrorist organization, it kind of disbanded. And the shift of power, interestingly, came to Indiana, where my hometown is. When this happened, they started to form different organizations to try to regain control. One of those organizations was called the Supreme Kingdom. And this was emerging at the same time they were having all of the debates on evolution and fundamentalism. And they were branding any Christian who wasn't a fundamentalist against evolution as being a false Christian, much like today the New Apostolic Reformation brands anybody who doesn't agree with their political policies as a false Christian. Their intent was to regain control of the education system because they were teaching evolution. They wanted to gain control of the government because they believed that the false Jews had taken over the government, and so it was allowing this evolution to come in. They were trying to persuade people through media, and they even got into the film. I don't know if you know that history. The Klan was producing videos and had movie films that were played all throughout churches. So if you go through all of the seven mountains and the seven mountain mandate, they were actually doing this in what was called the Supreme Kingdom, which was a very short-lived organization. But what happened was, even though that organization was short-lived, the movement itself began to spread. And this began to invade what became the fundamentalist version of Christianity.
Interesting. When was that the kingdom movement was happening? Is that the 50s or
No, much earlier.
earlier? I imagine
Yeah,
Scopes
earlier.
monkey trial
Right. This would have been in the 20s.
20s. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And from there, I mean, you mentioned that college that Mr. Bolter went to in, what was that, Houston, or is that Dallas?
Dallas, right.
Dallas.
Christ for the Nations Institute.
Right. And so, I mean, that seems to me to be some sort of central hub of the New Apostolic Reformation. I mean, would you say that that's an accurate description of it?
Well, that's the difficult part, right? Nobody can tell what the New Apostolic Reformation is because the NAR itself also can't tell what it is. There are all of these apostolic networks. And so, yes, it is a central hub, but there are more central hubs. And which one is more central than the other one, right? You've got this spider web going across the globe of all of these things. But what I can say, so in that history that I mentioned with William Branham, healing revivals swept across the world, and they're going all across the different continents with all of these ministries, and they're teaching divine healing. They're teaching elements of Christian identity doctrine. They're teaching weird things that in today's world, Christians would just look at and say, what in the world is this nonsense? But as they're spreading this, they start to birth what became known as the deliverance ministry. And so ministers were coming in, being trained how to cast out demons and being trained more to the point what a demon was, which gets really funny if you understand it. I have a book. I should have got it out for this podcast, but I've got a book of one of these training manuals for deliverance ministries. And it's talking how to cure the demon of hiccups and different nonsensical things, man. Like there was a demon of cataracts, and you pray this certain prayer. It becomes almost like a casting a spell if you're a shaman or something like this.
Yeah.
Well, this is spreading across the globe. They're teaching ministers how to do this. This grew into, so the Voice of Healing, which started for Branham's ministry, began to form an organization with a hierarchy where they're training and establishing ministries and giving them quite fictitious backstories. I'll just say it like that, and you can take with it what you will. But they created stage personas, essentially. And these stage personas began to collaborate together to form deliverance seminars. And so if you came to one of these seminars, they could teach you how to cast out the demon of cataracts or the hiccups or whatever is the thing that they're teaching. So Gordon Lindsay, who founded Christ for the Nations, was William Branham's campaign manager through all of those years, from the late 1940s up until I can't remember what year he left. But they were collaborating together, and they were holding, in fact, I just got one in my email today, another advertisement for Branham and Lindsay and a few other guys holding a deliverance seminar to teach these people how how to cast out demons. After Branham died, people were still familiar with this process, so they kept coming to Lindsay. And I want to say it was the 70s, 1970s, he created Christ for the Nations.
Interesting. I just the whole casting out of demons and the curing cataracts and hiccups. I just it strikes me as odd that there can't have been any successful results to these other than charlatans and having
Yeah.
inside men that were claiming it. But I just, if any other product was on the market with zero results, it would fade away. And yet to this day, we have people casting out demons and laying hands on and healing. At that time in the 70s, when you mentioned specifically, because you talked about the racist roots of the movement, I'm thinking of Bob Jones University, Oral Roberts University, which are all segregated at the time.
Right.
Or I guess it was it was at the time of the civil rights passage that they had to integrate. And I'm wondering if they are as affiliated with these movements as well. I mean, obviously they're evangelical.
There are I have yet to publish all of the connections on my website. It gets overwhelming at times. But so here's another interesting fact. And, and to piece it together, I need to give you some back history, I think. I do cover this as well in the book in much more detail, but we talked about the fundamentalist movement, the Scopes trial, all of this stuff. Well, this birthed a movement in the United States where they were really actively trying to push out evolution. And there was a man by the name of Gerald Burton Winrod. And he was just a humble, not very rich minister from Kansas. And he goes and has conference with Adolf Hitler in Germany before it became Nazi Germany.
Okay.
I don't know what happened. Nobody knows what happened, but he came back with a lot of money, a lot of money. And he also came back with a book called the Protocols of the Learned Elders of Zion, which is one of the most anti-Semitic books in history.
And a forgery, if I'm not mistaken, completely
And a
fake.
forgery. It's a crazy, crazy history. This became the
Yeah, I think it
backbone of
was
Christian identity, this book.
right. It was Russian intelligence working for the royal family
I,
at the time, I
I
think,
think
that
so, yeah.
crafted
I
it,
think
which is interesting because the Russians and the Germans were enemies at the time. But I guess if you, if you're writing anti-Semitic books,
yeah,
I gotta dive in. I am Hitler after all.
yeah. Well, there was a big movement in politics. There was I'm drawing a blank on the guy's name, but there's a famous politician that stood against the evolution, and he was nicknamed the defender of the Christian faith. So Winrod comes back with all of this money and this anti-Semitic book, and he creates an organization called the Defenders of the Christian Faith. And he's working with one of the key figures who's touring with him is Charles Fuller of Fuller Theological Seminary, which produced C. Peter Wagner, who is the one who named the New Apostolic Reformation. So there's connections in that direction. Well, there's another interesting connection, also out of Germany. There was a man by the name of William T. Frary von Blomberg, who was William Branham's campaign manager. He was the adopted cousin of Werner von Blomberg, who was avid homosexual. So here you have this movement that is largely against homosexuality, has been for decades, led by a homosexual man, touring ministers around the globe. The ministers who are with him know that he's openly a homosexual. And he is working with the Fellowship Foundation. He is one of the directors of what became the Fellowship Foundation. If you're not familiar with this, they're called the Family. They hold the National Prayer Breakfasts for many, many years. Big influence on Washington, D.C. It's a crazy history if you go down that rabbit trail.
Wow,
But he
that's
was
the prayer
also
breakfast that is popular to this day. That
exactly,
the
exactly.
presidents attend.
Exactly. It's that same one that we're talking about. He was on that board, but he was also on the board of directors of Bob Jones University. All of these men were collaborating. And that's the hard part for people to understand, because here you have the Fellowship Foundation, which doesn't seem to be Pentecostal. They're holding prayer breakfasts. Here is Gerald Burton Winrod, who is holding services for Amy Semple McPherson in the deep, deep in the heart of Pentecostalism as it's being birthed. Here's a man from, um,
Was that at the
all over the
Angeles
globe.
Temple right here in Los Angeles that was happening?
Exactly, Angelus Temple.
I'm 5 blocks from there as we
Well,
speak.
and it gets really crazy. I mentioned this too as just casual facts that you just wouldn't believe that are happening. So Winrod, because he came from Nazi Germany and he's spreading this anti-Semitic nonsense, they labeled him the Kansas Hitler, and that was his nickname, the Kansas Hitler. He was spreading Nazism throughout the United States, basically. The very Sunday after the Night of Broken Glass, whenever all of the Jews were,
Mm-hmm.
their buildings destroyed, etc. The very Sunday after this, Amy
Crystal
Semple
Knot.
McPherson, yes, Crystal Knot, Amy Semple McPherson had him take over her pulpit to show her support for the before the Nazi guy. And that's deep in the heart of Pentecostalism being formed. So you have all
Wow.
these connections. You can't say that Pentecostalism is Nazism, but here they did this very, very bad thing in their history. What do you do with this, right?
Beats me. What do they do with this? They just bury it, I would imagine.
They bury it. They certainly do.
Yeah.
And that, honestly, that's what has established a pattern. You have things that are so bad that, like I said, some of the things I can't even say or YouTube will block us. That bad of things in the history. And what do you do with this? You have to just simply try to forget it and walk on. And that's what's the pattern that has been established. They just do not want their history to be uncovered. And once that pattern was established, now you have people who are in the prophetic movement. If their prophecies fail, if they prophesy Trump will be elected right this coming election and then he doesn't, well, then they just forget about it and absorb it and move on, because that's what the movement historically has done.
Sure, of course. That is how cognitive dissonance works. You pay attention to the hits and dis- you ignore the misses.
Yeah.
So the kind of sort of brings us up to the movement as it stands today, which is no longer happy to be an apolitical movement as they were at one point, but rather a very political movement. In fact, they want to, I mean, it seems to me they're very anti-democratic. They would like to have a theocracy of sorts in America. They believe that Trump is their man. Putting Paula White into the White House certainly was a huge,
Yeah.
gift to them, I would imagine. And they're feeling rather empowered right now.
Absolutely. And
Who
it's
are their
really
enemies?
interesting. It's interesting if you know the history too, because while they will say that they have been lifelong Republicans, if you go back in their history, because of this history that I'm talking about, whenever Franklin Delano Roosevelt was in office, the party actually flipped. The side that was taking the fundamentalist group, that it actually was the Democrats, and the Klan was all embedded into the other side. And then they kind of
Yeah.
flipped because of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. But you're right. They have stood off and they've tried to pretend to be apolitical. But I was just having this conversation earlier today in another interview. Here's what you have to understand. When you're on the outside of this movement looking in, it looks to be apolitical. And if you were to go visit one of the sermons of the people who are preaching, you would say, well, they're preaching about this subject in the Bible. There's no politics here. I grew up in it. I grew up in the side that was on the inside, not the outside. What the movement has been doing for decades, whenever they want you to vote against somebody, you can't really say, don't vote for so and so in a religious setting, because there are laws that that prevent this.
The
You can't do
Johnson
this.
rule, I believe, is what it's called.
Exactly, which is why Trump wanted to overturn this, right?
Yep.
There are there are so many laws against it. You can't openly do this, but what they have done is insidious. What In the way that the cults have loaded language around certain key doctrines, they will also load language from the Bible for different political parties. So they may be talking about Ahab, for example, and Jezebel. Well, they will brand one candidate or the other to be Ahab, and then they'll go preach this series on sermons on Ahab. So if you're an outsider who's walking in and you're hearing a sermon, well, it's about Ahab, it's about the Bible. This isn't politics, but every single person sitting there knows exactly who they are talking about.
Interesting. But I feel like it goes beyond that even now, just the violation of the Johnson rule into where this is an actual grab for power on a national level that uh you know in my more hyperbolic moods I might say resembles The Handmaid's Tale or something like that. I mean,
Right.
an actual theocracy in America, which is what I believe they dream of, if from my limited research compared to yours.
Yeah, absolutely. And they've dreamed about it for decades. That's the part that for me as I'm going through the research, I'm just blown away every single fact that I uncover because before Amy Semple McPherson's movement began, there was another movement in Zion City, Illinois, a man by the name of John Alexander Dowie, who is one of the greatest con artists known to world history. And
Wow.
he was going across he actually stole his first church in Australia. But as he's being kicked out of the country, I walk through this in one of my books. It's called Militant Christian Extremism, uh, examination of John Alexander Dowie. But he stole a church, and as he's running from countless crimes that the government's
When you
after him,
say stole a church, sorry, I've just never heard that that actual sentence come out of somebody's mouth before. So could you explain what you mean?
it's the funniest story, man. I'm going through his actual writings. The man, he's well respected in Pentecostalism, believe it or not. But he's going through all of his writings, and in one place, he seems to be, maybe he's got Alzheimer's or something. He's got some problem where he's opening up far more than he should, and he's talking about the sins of his past, and he starts talking about it. Well, I have a curious mind. I want to know, well, what did you do, man? Why are you writing about this? So I went and pulled, I want to say I read over 100,000 newspaper articles, as many as I could
Wow.
find to write that book. But he starts attending a church, becomes embedded with all of the people there. He's well respected, such to the extent that the minister takes a leave of absence for being when he was sick. So he goes out on his hiatus and says, will you handle my church? Well, while he was in there, he overthrew everyone and started chastising people who didn't adhere to his supreme authority, to the extent that he stole the church, which is, it's one of the craziest stories ever. But this led to all kinds of rioting, etc. Long story short, he fled the country. He comes to the United States and pretends to be a faith healer. And he's carrying around satchels of these letters that say, in this other city or even in this other country, I healed so and so, and here's their testimony. So he's reading these, and people come give him tithes, money, etc. In 10 years, he amassed $10 million in 1890. This is, in
Wow.
today's money, it's a $500 million. He literally took over Chicago to the extent it was, they did not know what to do with him. They couldn't convict him. They couldn't kick him out. There were hundreds of thousands of people coming to see him. They finally moved to Zion, Illinois, and this was a country inside of our country at one point in time. So this became the prototype for everything that I'm talking about, this weird divine healing mess. It grew to such an extent that he controlled Illinois politics. If he said vote for this guy and all of his cult did, well, it swayed enough votes. He literally could steer the politics. And he realized the power that he had. And so he created the Theocratic Party to try to take over Washington and take over the nation, and failed, but he did try.
That was
His
the actual name of the party, was the
That was
Theocratic
the
Party.
actual name of the party, was the
Well,
Theocratic
at
Party.
least they're honest and upfront. I'll give them that.
Well, this became the backbone for what we see today, because everything that I've mentioned and all of these very strange, odd stories, they're all connected if you know where to look. So John Alexander Dowie, his commune was Zion City. In that city is where Gordon Lindsay was born, the founder of Christ for the Nations. In
Uh-huh.
that city, his leader of his director of music was a man by the name of F.F. Bosworth, who mentored William Branham in the healing revivals. So everything that he did, right down to he claimed to be the return of Elijah the prophet, John Alexander Dowie did. Well, when he died, William Branham starts to claim that he is the return of Elijah the prophet. And the New Apostolic Reformation starts to claim this weird notion that the Elijah spirit is coming, and what they were doing in, I don't know how they phrase it, but like in type, John Alexander Dowie was the Elijah for his day, William Branham for his day. Now it's the people. Now we're all who have this apostolic authority are claiming the spirit of Elijah. So all of this is connected, but it's so weird to think of all of the different nonsensical stories that I have just told you.
Absolutely. And I mean, again, the whole idea of modern prophets and apostles is just, I mean, it's, you're just so open up for charlatans. Do you feel like that's part of it? Because, I mean, obviously, our friend from Australia who took over Illinois was an admitted charlatan, but I, 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 I don't know if this is something you'd be comfortable answering, but like you mentioned Joel Osteen and Paula White. I mean, they just scream charlatan to me. Do you think these are deeply faithful people, or do you think that these are people for whom a grift was taught to them, passed on from previous generations, and then that is the tradition they're in? They're not in a Christian tradition, they're in a tradition.
It's a very complicated question. Having grown up in this ministry and understanding how things work, there are people who are truly grifters. William Branham, beyond the shadow of a doubt, we have uncovered enough information about him. He was a grifter. He fully was lying through his teeth. He would go to one city and claim one thing, go to the next city and claim something different. Very much like the snake oil salesman that you see in Bonanza or Rawhide, any of these old shows. So there are people who are truly grifters. Those people, because of the way that they have the charismatic personality, they attract other people. And in a faith healing type of movement, you usually attract people who are struggling mentally or struggling physically with a sickness or mental condition. Those with the mental conditions are the ones who are most susceptible to this, because as they come in and they start to believe this, they'll believe pretty much anything to get the demon out of their head. So they're held captive by fear that they actually have a literal demon in their head. Well, because of the mental health issues, they too sometimes see visions because of the mental health issues. So they'll start to prophesy, etc. And then you start to see this pattern where their prophecy, it's not from God, it's from this mental condition. It doesn't come true. But if they ever strike one of them right by accident and have 10 false prophecies, but have one of them just hit the mark, because everybody's in this condition where they're looking so hard to find something to make their life better, they'll grasp whatever was the thing that happened that was correct. So there are people who are in it who truly believe that they have this power, this gift, and they have some kind of mental condition instead. Well, then it gets more complicated than that, because now those groups of people have all produced offspring, and the offspring was raised like this. I was one who was raised like this. So I look to all of this mess, and I believe when this guy says he's a prophet, because this other guy believes he's a prophet. And this person who has the spiritual experience, I don't think about the fact that they have mental health issues. I think instead, well, wow, God did the thing that they said God did. So I wouldn't consider myself to be a con man, even though I believe this thing, but it produces a cycle, a it produces this cycle wherein people have offspring that support the ministry itself, and it ever evolves and keeps growing. It keeps growing in the nonsense because as the nonsense continues, more nonsense is added to it with offspring to support the nonsense, if that makes any sense.
That does make sense, and it makes me wonder now, bringing things up to the Bolter guy again. Uh, his actions on the surface seem like he was suffering from mental conditions. Those are not the actions of a stable person, but they could also be the actions of a true believer
Hmm.
who is not mentally compromised, but actually buys into every sermon he's heard and the messages coming out. And at which point, it's like, does it even matter anymore if it's mental illness or if it's a true believer? And is there even a difference? And is it crazy to say, should we anticipate more of this? I mean, is this the fervor the movement is experiencing right now? Because they truly see this. Whereas from my research, again, they see new prophets, uh, new apostles walking amongst us. I assume from what I read, they also see devils walking amongst us. The enemy is here as well, and that the spiritual battle is now. That this is, of course, like all religious groups, they say the end times is now. The battle that has been brewing since Cain and Abel uh, is right here, right now, and they are in the thick of it. Is that an accurate way to look at it? Is should we be anticipating more violence on the part of the New Apostolic Reformation?
If history has any say in it, I would say that absolutely. If you look through just the history that I've mentioned, which is only going back to the 1900s, and I'm certain you can go before this, this is a cycle that continues. And as I said, it continues with more nonsense as it goes. But the thing that you have to really understand is there's another component to it that may be playing a factor. We don't know yet what happened with Bolter. More of that information will come out in the investigation. But you have to also consider radicalization. When you're in this type of movement, many people are radicalized. And the sad part is that many people don't realize that they're radicalized. Some of the doctrines that they're spouting off, we need to claim dominion, the end time's coming, we need to be preparing for this battle that's coming. We're going to take arms and fight for this battle. It is radicalized to the point. Growing up, one of the things that Jesus said that I really found to be profound. Jesus said, "My kingdom is not of this world." And whenever I would get into a situation when people would, in school, people pick on you. Well, my kingdom's not of this world. They can pick on me. When people misuse me, mistreat me, my kingdom's not of this world. I'm looking for something better. I never wanted to fight back unless I had to, and only whenever you have to. That was my mentality, because that was kind of what Jesus taught. But what this movement has done, they have radicalized to the point where they see the kingdom as something they need to claim for themselves forcibly. And the way that they're doing it, from what we said in the beginning of this podcast, where they're taking Bible verses and they're applying it to today, whenever it should have been applied to the historical children of Israel. Anybody who has been radicalized with that frame of mind, what happens is the more it's preached, the more they're talking about how we need to stand up, we need to fight, they use very militant words in their sermons. Well, people go home and read the Bible thinking about those militant words that were used in the sermon, and then start reading about the actual battles that happened with ancient Israel, where there were countries conquered, where there were people claiming dominion of other people. This is a thing that if you read the Old Testament, you actually see this playing out. Well, to the person who's been radicalized, what's the trigger that connects them from the sermon that they heard with all of those militant keywords to the actual Bible that they're reading, where they say, oh, well, this is what I need to do. I need to step up and do this. I'm going to be the one. I'm going to be the one to fight for our freedom, to fight for our dominion. These people, there are many people who are radicalized. It doesn't mean that many people will act out upon it, but it's like the sleeper cell suicide bomber. All it takes is that one statement that triggers that thing in their head where they go off and do something destructive. I don't know if that's what happened with Bolter. We won't know until the investigation. But I can say that many of the people who are associated with the movement that he said he's from, which is the movement that I came from as well, many people in that are radicalized.
Right. And the people that they listen to, the sermons that they're listening to, do you think that there's a stochastic element to them where these people are aware of the fact that their flock can be triggered into acting? Is this something that you think they're actually trying to brew?
When I was writing the book, I was mortified at some of the things that I was reading. I just wanted to see, and what I seeing in history, am I seeing it playing out today? Once I got to about halfway through the book, I wanted to know, where am I going with this? Am I going towards the political side of the NAR? Am I going to the individual churches? And so I just did some internet searches on what is Sunday's sermon? And obviously I did some keywords like, keywords that I knew would bring up NAR churches. I was finding sermons about civil war. There were actually ministers who were preaching civil war. Come Sunday for your blessed Civil War sermon. And I'm thinking, what
They're
on
not
earth?
talking about the one from 1860 to
They're
1865.
not talking about that one. No, it's, and so, and you dive deeper and you look, and the first thing that hit me was, okay, is this guy connected to the thing I'm talking about? So you have to go through the newspapers and trace the history of the church. Where did it come from? It's a lot of work, but you start to see it all comes back to the same thing. And it's not just, when I started this book, I thought it was just Branhamism, but it's not just Branhamism. You can trace it all the way back to Christian identity. You can go before that to the political elements of British Israelism. You can trace that back as far, you can trace that all the way into England. And I did some of that, but you start to see, like I said, it's this thing where something is just slightly off of the mark. The British Israelism, for example, is just slightly off. Yes, it's a good thing to call yourself a child of God, and that's essentially what it began. We're the children of Israel. We're the children of God. But it's slightly off because then you're branding the people who aren't the children of Israel. And so
Yep.
because that was slightly off, well, then they added something else to it, and then something else. And once it came into America, they added all the racism to it, all of the anti-Semitism to it. And you can carry that forward if you want to. You can carry it all the way up into the charismatic movement, into the NAR today. They keep adding things to it. And what it has done is, number one, it's made it into this weird mess that is very destructive and dangerous. But to the people who are outside who don't understand the history and understand what it is, when you look in, it doesn't look like the same thing. So as history is repeating itself, it looks like something entirely different, but it's actually the same thing.
Sounds like you're describing some sort of religious stone soup where it's just been added to so much. I have to say that as soon as you hear the NAR preachers referring to us non-NAR folk as Amalekites, time to run.
Exactly, especially the ones that are carrying weapons.
Absolutely. So I guess I'd like to close with, do you have any message of hope? Is there a way to de-radicalize? You came up in the movement. Is there a way to communicate with these people, or is this just going to have some sort of terrible ending?
Well, the sad truth is, when I grew up in this, obviously I grew up born and raised in it, so I didn't know what I was in. But there comes a point in everybody's life whenever they go through a period of soul searching. They want to know, Why am I here? What is this world and why am I in it? Every single person who's on the face of the planet goes through this. This type of religion has trained people to suppress critical thinking. And once you go through that point in your life where you're doing the soul searching, if you're in the movement that teaches you to suppress critical thought, you're going to stay in the movement because you have critical thought. And whenever they heap all of this political language, this militant language in your head, if you don't have critical thought, it just gets planted and it's sitting there and can be activated. It's the activation that scares me because of the sleeper cells and people who might be radicalized. But if you teach the people to engage in critical thinking, if you're a Christian, think about the Bible. Think about the passage from the Old Testament that they're saying applies to a Democrat or a Republican. Does it really? Can you read the whole history in context? I mean, one of the biggest freedoms for me when I left, we read passages, and I can't even count the number of sermons where the guy would say, I'm going to take this verse from this book as my context for the sermon. And I began to realize, well, that's not a context. You have to read the passage, you have to read the book. And one of my biggest freedoms was to learn and understand not just the book, but the cultures around it. What was it talking about? Who were the peoples that were being spoken of? And if people, it's a lot of work, but if people were to go through that process of just at least think about the things that are being said, does it really apply to today? Or is that something that happened long ago? Once you start that process of critical thinking, people snap out of it.
But as you're saying that, my first thought is, and yet the Department of Education is going bye bye. So, how do we get that critical thinking out there? I wish I knew.
Yes, that is the challenge. If they're unwilling to participate in the education, it makes it hard.
Absolutely. Man, this has been such an informative episode. Thank you so much, John Collins, author of Weaponized Religion From Christian Identity to the NAR. I am absolutely going to buy that book. I need to know more because I feel like this is something that everybody needs to know. This is not a one off instance. I mean, hopefully the violence will be, but the fact of the matter is that they are enmeshed in the Trump administration, in government, and they have plans, and we should be aware of those plans and know how to counter them.
Absolutely. And the brilliant part about the book is after this administration and the next one comes, the same things apply because it's the same thing over and over as history repeats itself.
Yeah. Thanks again, John. Really appreciate your coming on the show.
Thanks for having me.